as well, of private resolution of disputes. We already have international arbitration mechanisms for investment disputes. And these are not run by governments. Some are, but others aren't. You can, for example, go as an investor. If you have a problem with another investor or a government, you can go to the International Chamber of Commerce's dispute settlement resolution mechanism in Paris and sort it out that way. That's a sort of extension of the merchant law of old. But where I think I might disagree with it is that I don't think that that's a substitute for basic functions that governments need to perform. They are a complement, but not a substitute. Adam Smith instanced 3 basic functions of government. So they are, firstly, you need to defend the realm, the national defense, as it were. Now, you may come back to me and talk about privatization of the military and of various private arrangements to, for example, ensure the freedom of the seas, but I would dismiss them as utter utopia. It's simply not of this world, and to me that's fairly nutty talk. One needs, at a minimum, some kind of collective provision of defense for national security. One. Second, one needs the state to be an umpire for a core set of rules, because there is no substitute fully. There might be complements, but there is no substitute when it comes to the judiciary and to some basic functions of public administration. Essentially, for the core of the rule of law, one needs an impartial third party umpire, preferably a truly independent judiciary, not a privatized one. And thirdly, Adam Smith has a public goods function, which is a bit more open-ended. And I personally don't have a problem with government providing a basic safety net for the very poor, and that's different from a welfare state with entitlements, or with government funding up to a point of things like education and healthcare and hard infrastructure. I say up to a point, but with the proviso that the delivery should happen through competition among private operators. I'm not departing from Hayek here when I say all those things. So that, to me, is my agenda for government. Everything else is the agenda for individuals in their private spheres. And that's something I would defend in the public square, as it were, rather than some kind of slash and burn approach, which I think is counterproductive to advocate, because then you're simply repeating the rhetoric and the tactics of those on the other side.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
Yes, sir. Another question.
Does this work? Okay. Thank you. I would like to make a comment on just the last remarks which you made, and perhaps contrast it a little bit with what you said before. You said quite rightly, you remembered us, that capitalism or the free market economy couldn't arise except for some presuppositions within the society, some requirements in the society. For instance, Albert Hirschman in his book about capitalism showed that in the 15th and 16th century it was necessary to have some kind of security and some kind even of gentleman-like behavior of people in order to make it possible that exchange could take place among equal partners and that contracts could be kept. And I think this is a very important point. This is something which partly arose out of spontaneous interactions, partly also by rolling back the influence of the monopoly of the church and the state. And I think that's a very important point also for the, and I think this is more or less what we said before. But when you compare the performance of Asian countries with those of Europeans, then I would have be a little bit contradictory to what you say, because there's just a recent book a few weeks ago which appeared by Seymour and Robinson, Why Nations Fail. And they make the prediction that China will not be able to uphold its predominance in economic terms unless it goes to a more democratic, less autocratic mode of government. And I think this is a very important point. And we should not forget that also in the political sphere, it's necessary that we have not a top-down but a bottom-up approach. So that's the essence of the free market economy and economic liberty is that we have bottom-up things. This is the spontaneous order. And we need something similar in the political sphere, and therefore this people is still a People's Republic of China with the Communist Monopoly Party. They will have to go away, or there will be some kind of dialectical solution of these contradictions in the Hegel-Marxian erroneous terminology between this political and the economic sphere in this country. And I think this is the important thing which we always should see. The importance of this bottom-up instead of top-down. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why also the European Union has these big problems and there is so much hostility against the European Union, because it's just the top-down approach to all of these economic and political issues.
Thank you.
I'm glad you brought up that point, because that connects back to the discussion in the last panel on the relationship, perhaps the tension between democracy and liberty, economic freedom in the first instance. There is no straightforward correlation between the two. I agree with Professor Wieder's point that in the first instance it's economic freedom that's most important. When we talk of liberal democracy, I would put the emphasis, as he does, on the liberal. But there is, that liberal doesn't exist in a sealed compartment, which I think is part of the point you made. So what generalizations can we make about that relationship between liberty and democracy? Benjamin Constant used to talk about the liberty of the ancients, which is democracy, and not liberalism as we understand it in the modern sense, and the liberty of the moderns, which is individual freedom, rights protected, rule of law and all that. Well, and let's think of the empirical evidence here. There are no easy generalizations here. For poor countries, a minority have actually succeeded out of poverty into middle income status in the first instance under authoritarian regimes. Chile is one example between 1974 and 1989. China is an example of sorts. Economic freedom is still highly restricted in China, but it's a lot freer than it used to be, and it's happened under an authoritarian regime. Also true of South Korea and Taiwan. There are some examples of economic freedom expanding in parallel and seemingly being buttressed by a transition to democracy. The Eastern European countries are perhaps the best examples of that, where they've had largely successful twin transitions. But then there are a whole range of both authoritarian systems as well as democracies that have failed to expand economic freedom and as a consequence failed to increase growth and reduce poverty. India between 1947 and 1991 is a prime example. It gets a little bit more complicated though once a country hits middle income status and then seeks to go beyond middle income status to become a rich country. And there I think the book you mentioned has some important points to make. This is the recent book by Darren Asimoglu and James Robinson. Namely that an authoritarian system is even worse than a democracy most of the time, in that you have, through its opacity and through its cartelization, its political cartelization, vested interests who dominate the economy. So their interests are to have political power in order to have economic rents. Now that might not make that big a difference if you get some basics right in order to move, shall we say, from a per capita income of $500 a year to $5,000 a year. That's what economists call input-led growth. You need to marshal resources for that and mobilize the institutions to get your capital and your labor inputs in, which feed through into growth. But once you're at middle income level and you exhaust those possibilities of growth, you need growth to be more productivity-led. And the fact is, and this is true of China today, increasingly, that authoritarian systems which are blunt and opaque and are cartelized do not have the right set of institutions, including the lack of a rule of law, to move from simple growth to more complicated growth that is based on efficiency gains. And arguably, for all their faults, it's liberal democracies, because they are more transparent and have more checks and balances, that have the space for better economic institutions, more liberal economic institutions, including the rule of law, to facilitate that kind of productivity-led growth. And that leads to their prediction that if China doesn't change its political model, economic success will run into the ground and possibly reverse. And I think they have a point there. China hasn't reached that point yet, but it may reach that point in 10 to 15 years' time. And the pressures building up for political change in China, not just economic change, are increasing all the time. So those tensions will come to some kind of conflictual point sooner or later. In that sense, I think you're right. And there comes a point, to sum up, that economic freedom has more of a link with democracy, providing it's a liberal democracy and not the democracy of the ancients, which was, of course, truly illiberal.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a short break now, and I'm sure the speakers will be more than happy to comment and engage in the conversation further. And but we have to already stand there. Thank you very much.